Hello and welcome to the assessment number one briefing video for innovation management. And in this video, what I'll be doing is giving you a video walkthrough of this first assessment. And we'll be talking about the title of the piece. We'll be talking about the intention of it. Why does it actually exist as a piece of coursework? We'll be talking about ideas around structure, around your reading strategies, around the sorts of organizations or organizational scenarios that you might choose. We'll talk about referencing. Basically, what I want to do is provide this in a video so that you can return to it, as opposed to it being lost. It's just a conversation that we have before or after the lecture or in office hours. I want to give everyone the same information and the same access to that information. And you might watch this before you start the piece. So you might be watching it right now. You haven't put pen to paper at all, and you just want to get some ideas about how to start. And I definitely will be helping with that. You might find yourself hitting a roadblock as you're writing the piece. That happens in pretty much everything anyone has ever written, is that you're going to get to a stage where you're thinking, I'm not quite sure where to go next. So you might want to return to this. And maybe right at the end. So you might just want to make sure that you've kind of hit on most of the main points once you feel like you've finished the piece. I'd also like to remind you that on this channel, and you can use the links on the Moodle page as well, I've got a variety of other videos, and at some stages I will kind of forward you to those videos within this one. About writing a case study analysis. I would say that is really important watching for this one, because I go into much more detail about the approach to writing a really effective case study analysis. And there's also videos on how to increase your marks for theory and literature, and also how to find literature. And they tend to be about 5 to 7 minutes long, so they're quite short fire ones. So there's a whole variety of asynchronous resources at your disposal. First questions. What's the title of the piece? This is what you're going to be doing, and what we'd like you to do is copy and paste this and put this right at the top of your work. So don't use another title. Don't just create a title. This is exactly what you're being asked to do. It's very specific wording, and if you change that specific wording, it will change how you're answering the question. So you are to use this one. And I'm going to break this question down in 2 slides' time, but let's just look at the basics to start with. Drawing on literature from part 1 of innovation management and utilizing a real-life organizational scenario to inform your answer, critically evaluate the statement, to what extent is being a first mover the most effective innovation strategy? So as I'll talk about in a couple of slides' time, you've got a very clear question there. To what extent is being a first mover the most effective innovation strategy? And you've got some pointers as to where we'd like you to go with that and the sorts of information we'd like you to include. You're going to be including literature, you're going to be including an organizational scenario, and you're going to be doing critical evaluation. So these things are all built into that. So that's why it's important for you to keep looking at this question, not rewording it, not changing it. The word count for the piece is 1,500 words. There's no plus or minus 10% allocation. So 1,500, if you write over 1,500, then normal penalties are incurred. And what this does include is essentially everything from after you've pasted that title. The title isn't included, but everything after that is, until you get to the reference list at the end. So everything in the text is included. So that includes in-text references. When you put brackets, XYZ person 2022, that is included within the text. Some folks ask, are footnotes included? Yes, footnotes are included, which is why we would generally suggest don't include footnotes. If something is important enough to be included in the word count, then put it into the main body. If it's in the footnotes for a 1,500 word piece, it is not necessary in a piece like this. So everything is included apart from the title and the reference list. Simply drag your cursor, first word to the last word. That's your word count. When it comes to examples of previously marked essays, we don't provide full examples of this. We tend to find that actually inhibits students' creativity. But what we are going to be doing in seminar number 4, or what we have done, depending on when you're watching this, what we will do in seminar number 4 is we go through an extract of a very similar kind of piece. And what this gives you the opportunity to do is it allows you to see the style of writing that we're looking for. So we will be looking through a particularly good piece, we'll be looking through an average piece, and we'll be looking through a poor piece. And the way that we've structured those examples is so that they still do include somewhat of an introduction, somewhat of a conclusion, and somewhat of a main body, but it's just in a shorter version. So each of those are just a page. So in seminar 4, we'll be going through that. You'll have an opportunity to mark those pieces of work, and we'll discuss what the outcomes of that and some of the key pointers. So no full essays that you'll be able to see from previous students, but we will have extracts. And what is most important that comes out of those extracts is you get to see some examples, but also most importantly, you get the discussion about what actually we are looking for with this. How's the essay marked? A great question. Thanks for the question. Let me introduce you to the marking grid. And you'll notice when you come to do assessment number 2, the marking grid is similar. Both pieces are influenced by each other. So where everything that I'm saying here, all the skills that you're developing here, you are still going to be using in assessment number 2 as well. So everything that you learn from this and the feedback you get from this is also going to help to inform what you do later. And you can access this marking grid in a variety of ways. If you go onto the assessment brief and you scroll right down to the bottom on the very last page, the marking grid is there, but I've also just extracted that and put it into a single document. So if you go into the assessment tab on Moodle, there's a link directly to this marking grid. And I would really, really highly, as well as having the title always to hand, I would really suggest having this marking grid to hand, because we literally use this. This is what we use for every single piece. Having a clear marking rubric for us as markers is very important to ensure consistency. It's very important to ensure that we are commenting on similar areas in students' work and making sure that your mark is a fair mark. So we don't just read through and go, oh, I think this is about a 55, this is about a 67, this is about a 74. We have a much more mechanistic approach to that marking and a much more rigorous approach to that marking. So things for you to notice here. If you look from the top down, that's where we're looking at the various grading bands. So we've got first class, upper second, lower second, and then after that, we won't go through those today, but we've then got the thirds and the fails. So that's just going from the top down. But really what I'd like you to look at is these 4 categories. So we've got theory and literature, analysis and application, evaluation and argumentation, and presentation. Theory and literature, up to evaluation and argumentation, those 3 criteria are all worth 30% and presentations worth 10%. So the way that we work out your mark is essentially, while we're marking your work, we will give you a mark for each of those criteria individually, and then your overall mark will be a combination of those 4 marks put together. Now, the reason I say this is because it is really important that you're then consistently hitting these criteria, because what you want to do is kind of be in consistently across bands, consistently in the upper second or consistently in the first class. What you don't want to be doing is be really strong in one area and say, okay, well, my essay is really, really good for my understanding of the theory, but I don't actually answer the question, because that's going to impact your mark. In that case, you would end up with, you know, maybe a good mark for theory and literature, but a really low mark for evaluation and argumentation. So you need to make sure that they are consistent across. And the way we've designed this marking criteria is to make it easier for you to be consistent, is that there is some, these different criteria do inform each other. They do speak to each other. So 4 different criteria, and be consistent across them. So if we come to theory and literature to start with, and I'm just going to highlight, for the moment, I'm going to highlight what would be in the 70s and what would then be in the 50s, just to give you a kind of a bit of a contrast between those. And what are we actually looking for with theory and literature? I would say that the quickest way of describing this is we are looking for a breadth of understanding from a range of different subject positions, but we're also really, really looking for a depth of understanding. So if you are going to try and include everything from all of the study units, you know, that might give you some breadth, but actually what most of the comments refer to in this marking criteria is actually understanding the content that you are exploring. So if we were to sit down and speak with you and ask you about questions about the particular theories that you're exploring, would you actually be able to answer that? Would you be able to hold a conversation about that? So you need to be able to signal this in your assignment. So that means that, you know, you're going to be going beyond just describing, you're going to be going on just going beyond just giving us a simple sentence about something, but actually telling us what you know about it. So if you look in the 50 to 59s, we've got one of the key points, I think, is may use technical language without showing full understanding. And the way that you show full understanding, we'll go on to explore in a little while. So breadth and depth. And what we want to see here, if we go back to breadth, we do want to see a range of different subject positions. So you're being asked a question about first mover about being a first mover, about being a pioneer, and asked the extent to which you see this as an effective innovation strategy. Now, that question automatically implies that there are different sides to this argument. And because there are different sides to this argument, those that would say, yes, being a first mover is always good, those that would say, no, you should never be a first mover, and those would say, it depends. So variety of different subject positions. To score those higher marks for theory and literature, you're going to want to include voices from each of those parties, each of those camps, each of those different positions. We're going to want to hear something from. So that is where it comes down to the breadth of understanding. Then we come down to excellent use of course materials, but also showing wider reading. So when I say course materials, and this will come onto this in the next slide, this isn't just about using the lecture notes. So the way that the lecture notes are constructed is that they give you a kind of an introduction to the ideas. So the lecture slides themselves are an introduction. In the lecture, I obviously embellish on those points and I explore them and I go into more detail about it. And you will be expected to do the same thing in your coursework. You're expected to go beyond what the lecture is telling you. And we've made that easier for you because the reading list that's provided for this module gives you some really specific advice on what you could be reading and where you could start. So a suggestion here when it says about course materials is an excellent use of course materials is an excellent use of the readings that we've provided. So using the lectures just as a signpost and then going into more detail about the reading. And then the chances are you're probably going to be doing a bit of wider reading around as well if you're going to be going into specific depth about certain points. We want to see this written in an academic style rather than more said they're practitioner orientated. Practitioner orientated would mean, you know, how you might write a blog. It's got more colloquial language. It's more informal language. You know, this is an academic piece. So we want you to be inspired by the academic articles that we're providing for you. So there's advice in the two videos that I've got available, which is increasing your marks for theory and literature and also how to do your own literature searches. And in there, I give you 3 quick kind of hacks of quick ways that you can find literature. So if you are, for example, writing about dynamic capabilities and you find that we've only suggested you one big reading about dynamic capabilities and you need to find more, that video will give you a variety of different ways that you can go and search for literature really easily that goes beyond just like go into the library really easily, and a really easy way of getting a lot of literature very, very quickly. And then your job is simply just to read it and integrate it. So you notice with the 50 to 59s, you know, we've got some evidence of reading using technical language, mainly uses the core material. So not just using course materials, but mainly using the core material. So these ones will be more focused on just what's been covered in the lectures. So that's theory and literature. And then we move on to analysis and application. And it's called analysis and application because this is about if theory and literature is about how well you understand the theory that underpins innovation management. Analysis and application is, okay, well, how well are you applying that to a real life case? So if you think of how I construct the lectures, it would be more unsatisfying for you to walk into that lecture and sit there for 2 hours and I never reference a real life organization. Because I reference the real life organization, it brings the concepts to life. It shows you that this thing works in practice. So it's about applying the ideas. That's what we mean when we refer to analysis. And in this application, there's a continuum that we have to think about, because on one end, we've got what I've just described, which is we have an essay that is purely theory based. There's no application whatsoever. It is only based on theoretical constructs. And on the other hand, at the other extreme end of the continuum, we have an essay that is just telling us about an organization. It doesn't include theory, it doesn't include literature, it doesn't include insights from the module and the literature related to innovation management. So that's how to enter the continuum. And where you should be sitting on the continuum, we obviously don't want to be, we definitely don't want to be over this end. You want to be closer to this side. You want to be making sure that it's not just theoretical, but you do definitely want to be closer to that end. The example should be there to simply support your overall argument. Your example shouldn't be the main thing that we take away from this this assignment. And I'll suggest this later. But my suggestion is always don't start with your example. Don't start by thinking, what organization am I going to pick? Start by thinking, what is the argument that I want to make? And then introduce your example after that. This is how I write lectures. I don't start a lecture and saying, right, I'm going to talk about following strategy. Right, let's discuss Apple and how am I going to discuss what Apple do? It would take me so long. Instead, what I do is I say, what do I need to say about following? What do I need to say about following strategies? Or what do I need to say about Blue Ocean strategy? I structure it like that. That's the skeleton of my lecture. And then I can bring the examples in, and then I can cherry pick certain examples to particularly support points that I'm looking for. So we're looking at that theory and practice continuum, and we're using the theory with the example. So this is where you see that theory and literature and analysis and application do link together. So we want to have the theory in the foreground, and one way that I suggest this in the video doing a case study analysis or quick start guide to doing a case study analysis. It's in the playlists. Is that when you're writing a paragraph, I would say probably about 70 to 80% should be theoretically informed, and about 20 to 30% should be you exploring the case itself. So 70 to 80% should be where you are using that theory to explain what is happening in that scenario, rather than you just explaining via the example itself. So it's all about bringing in this theory. So we've got a range of theoretical insights. That's what you're asking to do. An excellent attempt to incorporate a range of relevant theoretical insights, well-chosen yet concise examples, and not too much description. So when it comes to well-chosen and concise examples, well-chosen means that you're not trying to do too much with it. So sometimes in these sorts of essays, what people try and do is they try and jam-pack it full of examples, and they say, I want to do lots of comparisons, and I want to compare across sectors, and I want to compare across different industries. Remember, you are asked to include one real-life organizational scenario. And with that, I would suggest where you're being pointed towards is you either pick one organization to explore, or you pick the relationship between two organizations to explore, and that's about all you've got time for. You've only got 1,500 words. So you might want to explore the relationship, if you're exploring the relationship between first moving and following, you might want to explore how two organizations have engaged in a battle of first moving and following, or you may choose to just explore one organization itself, but it's going to be something that really does exemplify the argument that you're making, but you're not spending too much time with that example. And again, I'm reinforcing these points, but generally speaking, my advice to students is make it slightly more theory heavy than you think it should be. That normally brings us into the right area, because sometimes we like to write about the example because it kind of like eats up our word count. It's a little bit easier. And in the first draft, you're going to find that you have written a lot about the example, and that is going to be the thing that can be trimmed back generally. So yeah, and then we're going to be seeing an excellent balance between theory and practice. So in this analysis and application, where you're picking your example, you're just going to be picking well-chosen vignettes, well-chosen stories from that particular example. You don't need to give us the entire history of an organization. You are just going to be telling us certain aspects of it that really help to drive your argument forward. Because fundamentally, this example is just it's a vehicle to help to support your argument. So then when we look in the 50s, we've got, it's going to be very descriptive. And by very descriptive, that means that you're going to be telling us loads about the history of the organization. You're going to be telling us a lot about describing what happens in the organization rather than using theory to actually analyze that and really explain that and talk about the pros and cons of that by using the theory. So description in this sense means you are going to be talking more about the organization in the absence of theory. So that is analysis and application. So yeah, watch that case study video, give you lots of tips for it. Evaluation and argumentation. So in evaluation and argumentation, this is how well you answer the question, how well you create an effective argument around the question. So again, you're being asked, to what extent do you agree that first moving is the most effective innovation strategy? If you're being asked anything like a to what extent question, then you have a number of different answers that you can come to. And we are expecting you to come to a conclusion. And that conclusion is either going to be, yes, it is the most effective, no, it isn't the most effective, or it may be the most effective, and it depends on something else, which you'll explore. So we are expecting you, by the time it gets to the end, we're expecting you to come to an actual concrete conclusion. So that is where you are explicitly answering the brief. In doing that, you will be exploring multiple angles. So a good argument doesn't just come from one perspective. So if you listen to someone constructing a good argument, what they're doing is they're drawing from a number of different angles. They're drawing the evidence that agrees with their position, but they're also drawing fairly from the evidence that doesn't agree with their position, so they can use that to create a better informed value judgment. So this is what creates a sense of balance, and this is what we're looking for in your piece. So whilst you'll be agreeing or disagreeing or maybeing, you still are going to want to create this balanced argument rather than saying, yes, first moving is definitely the most effective innovation strategy, and the whole essay is about that. No, we want to see critical thinking, and critical thinking means drawing from a number of different perspectives. And again, this is something that we saw in theory and literature, it's something we saw in the analysis and application. So you're also pointed towards here. So concepts not unquestionably accepted at face value are questioned in the light of the analysis. Pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses are considered and compared. So again, this suggests to you a kind of an idea about the structure. So you are actually being pointed towards saying, well, what are the pros and cons and strengths of weaknesses of ideas? And this is one way of starting your piece. You could look at first moving. What are the pros and cons of first moving? What are the strengths and weaknesses of first moving? And that starts to get your mind going in terms of what you might actually be writing about. So this is when you're being pushed towards that critical thinking. And then the final part of the argumentation is, how well is this brought together in the discussion and conclusion? And the discussion and conclusion is really important in this particular piece, because you're being asked a particular question. The discussion and conclusion is where you bring all of your insights together. It's kind of in a way, it might start off with you summarizing your insights in terms of this balanced argument, but you're also going to be offering something different. And I'll give you an example of that. If you look at how my lectures are constructed, normally the lectures are constructed in terms of giving you some insight about a particular topic. I then provide a more critical view on that topic. And then the last part of it is where I give you some more contextual information, a bit of a however. So we spoke about dynamic capabilities. We spoke about Suarez and Lanzola's matrix. So these parts I would consider as the discussion. And this is where we're providing more generalist insight to the topic, because what we're doing is we're going beyond just saying there's one side and there's another side, but that discussion is where you can really properly answer the question. That is where you say yes, no, or it depends. And then the last part then, for the evaluation and argumentation, in those 50s areas, you might not be providing a balanced argument. So it might be very, very heavily swayed towards one side. And because of that, you're not going to be spending a lot of time contrasting ideas and thinking about how they actually relate to each other. And the discussion included, normally discussions that fall into these lower marks, normally they're just a summary of what came before. So you say, there's these strengths, there's these weaknesses, and then the conclusion, you just say, in conclusion, there are strengths and weaknesses. Whereas a really effective discussion is going to say, yes, there are strengths and weaknesses, and this is what we've learned from it. And I'll talk a little bit about that in when we talk about structure. So that's valuation argumentation. Then when we come to presentation, presentation, it's important that you have a really effective introduction to your piece. That is going to be marked in the presentation. It's important that you have a good discussion, as we've spoken about. Signposting is also important. What signposting means is that at the end of your introduction, you're going to give a roadmap of what's about to happen. In this essay, I will, or this essay will explore X, Y, Z. But also in between each big section, so you're going to have, an introduction, part 1, part 2, and discussion. In between each of those big sections, there's going to be a little bit of work, maybe a sentence, maybe 2 sentences, that just kind of summarizes what's come before and tells the reader what's about to come next. Because what that signposting work that is doing is helping the reader to understand, A, that you know what you're talking about and that you know you've got a clear argument, and B, that it helps them to see the flow of the essay as well. So it says something about you, and it's also kind to the reader because it helps them to see the flow, as opposed to the reader trying to work out, okay, well, why were we here and now we're here? Signposting doesn't just mean putting a subheading in. You can use subheadings in this work, but it's not really necessary in a 1,500 word assignment. Signposting is more important, and if you're going to use subheadings, you still need signposting. A subheader doesn't do that signposting work. So that signposting is a way that you remind us what your key argument is, and you tell us what's just happened and tell us how you're moving forward. Presentation also links back to the academic tone and make sure that your referencing is complete and effective. This is the easiest way to not lose marks, is just to do your Harvard referencing properly. And there's plenty of advice on the UCL website as to how to do Harvard referencing effectively. And then if we look in the 50s to 59s, the presentation, so there might be an illogical flow, limited signposting, lack of coherent argument. So what this means is that the essay is a collection of parts. So instead of there being an actual story, a narrative that you're telling throughout, it is a collection of bits. So in the early stages, the introduction doesn't actually say what it's going to do, that we jump around from paragraph to paragraph. We don't know why the next paragraph has come or why it's constructed in the way that it is. So this is what we would think of as illogical flow. So they are our 4 different approaches. And I'm going to go into, on the slides that come after this, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about each one of these points, just to really emphasize some of the key points. All right, so let's talk in a little bit more detail about actually answering the question. The question here is, am I expected to answer a question? What do you mean when you say I must have an argument? So we've got on the left-hand side there what the question is, and I'm going to break that down for you. So we've got 3 different parts to that. Drawing on literature from part 1 of innovation management. So we know that it has to draw on literature. That is a key part of it, and that is the first thing that we say. So we know that has to be a key focus, is a literature and theory heavy approach to it. And it's got to be from part 1, which generally includes lecture 2 and lecture 3, maybe a little bit from lecture 1, but mainly lecture 2 and lecture 3, that narrative. The second part is using a real life organizational scenario. So an organizational scenario, as I said, is either picking one organization to explore or picking a battle between 2 organizations. We've said there, a real life organizational scenario, not an industry analysis, not a comparative analysis across industries or across sectors. We are looking for a smaller, more kind of micro example, a micro narrative there. So as I say, at the most, you're going to be looking at a couple of organizations and the relationship between those. And then finally, the important part, critically evaluate the statement. To what extent is being first mover the most effective innovation strategy? So critically evaluate means that you are really expected to engage with that. To what extent? To what extent implies that there is a number of different subject positions that you could take in relation to this argument, which is a yes, a no, or an it depends. In relation to that question of being a first mover, we know from the lectures that being a first mover isn't problem free. So we're going to expect you to explore that. And my suggestion for how you start this is that you actually start with your answer to that question. As you look at that question, maybe this is one of the early times that you're looking at it, maybe you haven't started yet, But start with your answer to that. Do you think that being a first mover is always the most effective innovation strategy? Yes, no, or it depends. Whatever you think there, that is really important because you can probably explain that in a very short space of time. You can probably say, yes, I think it is most important to be a first mover because reason, or no, because reason, or it depends because reason. That sentence or that couple of sentences is really central to your piece because that is what gives it a core narrative that runs the whole way through. So my suggestion is always with pieces like this is start with your answer and then work backwards and then think, well, how do I go about constructing an essay that helps me get to this answer? Because that will help you to act with purpose. If you don't know what your answer is, or if you don't know what your kind of general feeling is based on what we've spoken about in the lectures and seminars, then the chances are you're going to write a series of mini essays and never really answer the question. So that is where you want to begin. So when you have an argument, that is the story that you tell in relation to that italicized part. To what extent is being a first mover the most effective innovation strategy? And we can explore that a little bit further through looking at the structure. And I will say from the start, I'm going to suggest a generic structure here. And the reason I suggest this is because this is how I tend to go about constructing anything, whether it's I'm writing a lecture or I'm writing an article or I'm writing a chapter. This is generally how I go about constructing it. And I think it's a simple way of understanding how to represent a range of multiple different subject positions. There are various different ways that you can structure an essay. I'm not saying that this is the only one. So there's alternative ways that you could do this, but this is one way that you might go about structuring in it that I think means that it allows that you can talk about this range of different positions. So we know that in your assignment, you're going to want to have an introduction. And we suggest here that it's approximately 10% of the word count. That generally speaking is the advice for introductions. And in your introduction, what you don't want to do is just simply reword the question. I am going to look at literature and I'm going to use an organizational scenario and I'm going to evaluate this question. We know what the question is. What we want to hear about is what is your approach to this? What are the theories that you're going to use? What is the organizational example you're going to use? And what is your answer to the question? In this introduction, think of it more like a mini abstract rather than just as a summary. And the reason I suggest a mini abstract is because in an abstract, it kind of spoils the entire piece. And sometimes people are really reluctant to do this in an introduction because you kind of want to go, well, I'm just going to give you a hint at what's going to come, and then you're going to find out as the essay explores. You don't need to do that. Please don't do that. We are going to read through your essay multiple times. So we want you to spoil the answer right from the beginning. That is what tells us right from the start that you know what you're talking about and that your essay actually has a focus. So articulate what your answer is and articulate what the take-home lessons are and the kind of generalizable assumptions are that you make right at the end. A suggestion is that you write your introduction last. If you write your introduction first, your opinions will change as you move along because you'll find out a bit more information and you'll structure it slightly differently. The suggestion is write your introduction right at the very end. So once you've written your discussion, your introduction is kind of a mirror of that. It's bringing in most of what you've said in your discussion is going to be in the introduction. In the discussion, you bring everything together and you tell us what your take-home lessons are, and you tell us what your answer is. In the introduction, you're going to be doing exactly the same thing. So at most, what you're going to do is write yourself a little kind of holding introduction, but know that you should be coming back to that at the end. If you want a bit more advice on how to write a good introduction, one way that you can do this is that you start off by discussing the importance of the topic. So outlining that, you know, the debate amongst first moving is particularly rife, and give us some examples of that. So talk about the topic, talk about the importance of the topic. You're then going to talk about how you are structuring that particular work. And again, be very specific in terms of what is going to come in each section of your assignment. So how are you going to structure it? And then finally, you're going to say, what is your actual argument? What is your actual answer to the question? We love it when people say what their answer to the question is at the start. It makes it really, really simple to see that you have engaged with the question if you spoil it right from the start. So please try and do that if you can. Okay. So then we get to the what we'll call the main body of the assignment, and I'm suggesting here that you can split that up into part 1 and part 2, and this is going to be approximately 2/3 of the remaining word count. And you'll notice on the right-hand side there, we say specific to the organization. So this is where you do your organizational analysis. And when we say analysis, we're again remembering that this is going to be particularly theory heavy. So as an example here, various different ways that you can structure this main body, and this is going to be very much up to you. But as an example, one obvious route for structuring this is in part 1, you say, here is basically the evidence that would agree with the question. So yes, being a first mover is a more effective innovation strategy. Here are the advantages that come along with being a first mover, and you might look at blue ocean strategy, you might look at first mover advantages, but you're basically using the theory to talk about what the pros are from that side, and that's where you're gathering your evidence with a little bit from the organization and a lot from the theory, and using the theory to explain why this has been an advantage to the organization. So that might be what features in part 1. And then in part 2, this is the bit that would normally start with the word however, because however is a really good way of constructing that narrative, because you'd say, however, despite the fact that there are many arguments as to why there are advantages to being a first mover, there are also problems to be aware of. So part 2 could then explore some of those complexities. It could explore the pitfalls of first moving, or it could start by exploring some of the pitfalls of first moving. And this is something that came up a lot in lecture 3 and a little bit in lecture 2 as well. It could be the part where you talk about innovation being that more contested term, or strategic postures being a more contested term. It could be where you talk about first mover disadvantages, or it could be where you talk about follower advantages. So in part 2, you're looking for something to contrast with part 1. So it's almost like you've got 2 different hats on. In part 1, you've got first mover hat on. In part 2, you've got follower hat on, or you've got first mover disadvantages hat on. And in this, you're going to be using the example that you're discussing. So either one organization to talk about in both, or maybe you're going to use an organization to talk about in part 1, and then their competitors in part 2 to show how perhaps the follower eventually went, superseded the incumbent. So part 1 and part 2, and the suggestion is that these are contrasting sections, but they are signposted between. So you can see that part 2 and part 1 are actually related. And then finally, we come to the discussion. So this is going to be about 1/3 of the remaining word count, and it's generalizable to other organizations. So this is, you don't just have to talk about your kind of specific organizational scenario here, but this is definitely when you're going to come into a more theoretical overview. And in the discussion, this is where you might talk about saying, well, yeah, there are arguments for it and there are arguments against it, but it's too simplistic to just say, yes, it's good, or no, it's bad. And actually, in the discussion, we would say, well, it depends. It depends on the context, or it depends on organizations having different sorts of strategies, like being more dynamic. So the discussion is where you give that bit of complexity, you give that bit of nuance. And what this means is, in the discussion, imagine you were given a TED talk, and you were talking in that TED talk about a particular situation, a particular scenario that your organization faced, and you told the story about that, and you gave some theory for that. And at the end of the TED talk, someone would say to you, great, good to hear about what that experience is, but how does that relate to other organizations? What can other organizations learn from that, or what can they take forward from that? So in your discussions, you're going to talk about the general lessons about innovation strategy. What can other organizations learn from this based on the complexities and challenges that you've actually explored? Another way of looking at this is, if you imagine if you were being asked in an interview and someone said, tell me the main thing that you've learned about innovation strategy. Well, you wouldn't go through everything you've spoken about in part one and part two. You would probably summarize that and bring that all together by discussing your discussion points. So talking about, okay, well, actually, the main thing I've learned about innovation strategy is it is important to have this contextual awareness because blah, 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 blah. So in that discussion, that is where you're giving some of that complexity. And after that, there may be a bit of a conclusion in there as well, where you just kind of summarize it, but that's going to be really, really brief, where you just summarize it and say, in conclusion, I have said this is what the overall answer is. Now, we suggest that you start with that discussion because that gives you your answer. So that gives you your overall narrative, that gives you your through line. And this red line that goes through on the other side is a reminder that narrative needs to be present in the introduction, it needs to be present in the discussion, but the through line is also, it can be weaved throughout part one and part two. So when you're doing this signposting work or when you're introducing points, everything is going to lead into that discussion. And a good test of if you've got an effective argument is, can you summarize it in one sentence? So this is what I always ask students if I have one-to-one meetings with students about assignments and they ask me questions about things. The first thing I'll ask is, what is your essay about? Please summarize it for me. Summarize it in a sentence. And if you can do that, if you can say what your answer to the question is in one sentence, then you're onto a good thing, because that should be the through line of your piece. And then we get some specific questions. So is it okay just to use lecture materials? Well, the lecture materials are just the starting place. As I say, the way that the lecture materials are constructed is that they are themselves a signpost. In the lecture, I go into more detail about every one of those points, and it's expected that you will be going into details about each of those points. So the lectures are a starting point. They are a way of signposting you to what is important. And the lectures also help you to understand what the narrative might be of your particular assignment or of the argument that we're putting together. It is not suggested that you only use the lecture material. You don't need to reference the lecture slides. Please go back and actually reference the original materials that have been suggested to you. So don't just use the lecture material, but you can use a lot of the course materials that we offer to you. And by course materials, that means what are the references that have been cited in the lectures, and what are the sources that we provide to you in the further reading section, because they all relate to the narrative of those lectures. So it's not okay to just use lecture material, but you can use the course materials to really help to structure your answer. And so I'm drawing a distinction there between lecture material and course material. So think of it just as a toolbox. And yes, in the marking criteria, it's suggested that first class marks require extra reading or wider reading. And where should you start for this? And as I said, what we want to see is depth of reading. We want to see depth of your understanding. So you should start with your extra reading or with the suggested readings that we provide on Moodle, but it would be expected that there are going to be certain areas that you're going to want to go into more detail. So if we only provide you with one source about first mover advantage, or one source about dynamic capabilities, and that's an important part of your work, well, it would be expected that you would go away and do a bit of wider reading about those particular concepts. We're not giving you all the references that ever exist. We're giving you some really good key ones so that you can then go and find some more reading to support your arguments. And this is a way it shows your academic skill. So if you're wondering how to do extra reading or how to go and find extra reading, I suggest that you watch the video that I've put together, which talks about these 3 quick hacks of how to find literature. I use these 3 all the time, and it's a really good way of doing things. And do you have to include all the information from all of the study units? No, please don't do that. So all of the study units here would be generally lecture 2 and lecture 3, but also lecture 1, there might be some relevant points. You do not have to include all of it. So if you want to mainly talk about blue ocean strategy, and you want to talk about the advantages and problematics of blue ocean strategy, that's all good. You don't have to talk about blue ocean strategy and disruptive innovation and first mover advantages, and you don't need to include absolutely everything. We want to see some breadth of knowledge, but really we want to see a depth of understanding. So my suggestion would be to start off with a clear kind of core to what your work is. A good way of starting is, blue ocean strategy, or you might want to talk about first mover advantages, and start there and focus around that rather than trying to include everything. Because if you can try and include everything, yeah, it shows that you understand, or it shows that you understand that there were a variety of things covered, but you're never going to be able to show that you've got a deep understanding of each of those topics. You just can't do it in 1,500 words. You'd struggle to do that in 10,000 words. So you are going to be picking the really key parts that relate to your argument, and that you're going to be expanding them and providing a lot of depth and a lot of detail about them, rather than giving a little bit about a lot of points. So this is a comment that I will often write in feedback, which is you can do more with less, instead of doing less with more. So less with more is that you've got loads of things that have got tiny little bits of detail. It's kind of like very shallow holes that you're digging. Or you pick a couple of things, you're confident, and you pick a couple of things, and you go into a lot of detail about it, and that helps you to answer the question. That is what is going to stand you in better stead according to the marking criteria, because that's asking about depth, and it will allow you to really explore those points from in your application and also in your evaluation as well. So you're essentially there, you're picking bits. So yeah, that might be, I'm talking about blue ocean strategy, then I'm talking about disruption, then I'm talking about the importance of context, or I'm talking about first mover advantages, then I'm talking about the disadvantages that come along with that and the advantages of being a follower, and then I'm going to finish off by referring to the importance of dynamic capabilities. They would be two different essays. You wouldn't talk about blue ocean strategy and first mover advantage, then first mover disadvantages, then disruptive innovation, then follower strategies, then context, then dynamic capabilities. That is just too much. You won't fit it in effectively. So don't try and include all the information from all the study units. Folks often ask questions about case study analysis. So how many organizations should I pick for this essay, and what does organizational scenario mean? I've spoken about this a few times already in this video, but organizations, you're going to want to pick one, or I'd say a maximum of two. You're not doing an industry analysis, you're not doing a sector analysis, you don't need to do these big comparisons. You're either going to be talking about one organization that really fits your argument from both sides, or you're going to pick a battle between two organizations, where you've got a first mover and a follower, and you're exploring the relationship between those. That's what we refer to as an organizational scenario. That's why we're just saying, rather than just saying an organization, it's an organizational scenario. But this doesn't need to be multiple organizations. You don't need to keep bringing in lots of different ideas. Focus on one particular area. And what you're going to want to do with that is, find either an organization or an organizational scenario that does help you to understand, to exemplify the points you're making in part one, in part two, and in the discussion. So spending some time with that is important. And generally, this is why I would suggest, one of the most common questions that we get asked for this assignment is it okay to use X organization? And that's a really hard question to answer, because before we know what your argument is, I don't know. Generally, the answer is, it would be fine to use any organization, but it depends on what your argument is. So I would suggest do not start this assignment by thinking about what organization or organizational scenario you want to pick. If you start with the organization or the organizational scenario, the number of things that you could write about are huge. Whereas if you start by structuring your piece of work and creating that skeleton based on the theory that we've explored, you can then think, what organization actually fits this argument? And then you don't have to ask us whether the organization works or not, because you know that the organization works. All you then need to do is to say, my overall argument is, in part one, I'm doing this, in part two, I'm doing this, and this is what my answer is. Great. That's what shows that it's an effective essay. If you just start with the example, I think it just makes it significantly more difficult to explore this essay. So my suggestion would be, don't start with the organization, but instead start with the organizational scenario. Are there any organizations that you can't use as the focal point? For this first assignment, we've asked that the examples that have been explored in depth in the lectures and in the seminars for part 1 of the module are not re-explored in your assignment. So you can pick anything else apart from the things that we've explicitly explored in the lecture and in the seminars, and there's a list of those within the assessment brief as well. So they're the ones that you don't use. And if you're wondering then how to find other organizations, you might think, well, you've covered all of the best organizations. We haven't. We've just covered some. If you're wondering about how to find other organizations, then what you might do is you might go through and look at some of the suggestions for organizations that we've made within the further reading sections and the extra resources sections. You could look at things like HBR. In some of the lectures, I've also spoken about, just in passing, I've spoken about other organizations that might fit within Blue Ocean Strategy, or other organizations that might be examples of followers. You know, we've spoken a lot about other sorts of organizations. So it's very easy to find examples of organizations, you know, that have been a first mover, have done Blue Ocean Strategy. It is literally a Google search away. So that's how I would suggest that you find it. Then what should the balance be between theory and practice, and how much should I describe what happens in the organization? So I suggested earlier that there should be a balance here between about 70 to 80% should be around the theory and using the theory to explain and analyze, and around 20% should be organization focused, and that 20% really falls into that descriptive category. You say they did this thing. You know, when you're saying they did this and you're just describing to us what an organization has done in the past, that is what description is. You're not going any further, you're not going any deeper. What you then do after that is you actually use theory to say, and this is why it would be perceived as a strength, or this is why it would be perceived as a weakness, or as a pro or a con. So you're using the theory to not just describe what happened in the organization. So you're not just saying, this is an example of Blue Ocean Strategy. Cool. Tell me more. Tell me more about, okay, this is an example of Blue Ocean Strategy, but why would that be a particular strength for this organization? Or why would that be a problem for this organization, or a complexity or a challenge? So don't just describe what happens. That should be a really, really small amount of your overall analysis. What it should mainly be is you using this theory to unpack what happened, to look at the strengths, weaknesses, pros and cons. You might want to do a tiny bit of introduction to your organization in the introduction, but again, just a very, very short amount. So if you've got an organizational scenario, you can generally summarize this in a sentence to say, this is what the organizational scenario is that I'm looking at. This is what happened, and I'll explore it as I go on. So yeah, when you're using the examples, make sure that you link it with the study units, make sure you link it with the theory. And sometimes people ask here about how should I reference the case study, and do references to the case study count as academic references? And the answer to this is, if the reference to a case study is not an academic reference, then it doesn't count as an academic reference. So if the example that you're using is drawing on data that you got from their website, or from blogs that have been written about it, or from particular posts that have been written about it, this doesn't count as an academic reference. So the suggestion is, this isn't an essential, but a suggestion, is that you have two reference lists. You basically have a reference list that lists out all your academic references that you use. And then if you do have references to the organization that you're referring to, you can just include them in a separate reference list. That can be an easy way for you to see the distinction between how many academic references you've got and how many organizational references you've got. And it can also give you a good insight into the balance between theory and practice that you have. Do you need to keep referencing the case study as you go through the assignment? No, you don't. You don't need to apply the kind of same Harvard principles to the case study. We want to make sure that you're using the theory right, but it doesn't have to be the case with the organization. So if you look back through my lectures, I'm not referencing the case study when I'm talking about it. I'm talking about that as an organizational scenario. So, you know, you might want to reference it once at the start, but again, not essential. You are using that information to go through. Perfect. As I say, use the case study analysis video, and that will really help you. Okay, we're coming almost to the end now. How many references should I have? And I can give an annoying answer to this question. And this is always the answer that I was frustrated by when I was at university. And people say, well, how long is a piece of string? Um, and I think there's a better answer to that. Sometimes I'm reluctant to give you a specific number because if I say a specific number, and I'm about to, but if I say that specific number, then people just say, right, I'll just hit that number of references. What I want to do is I want to give you some contextual understanding as to why I'm going to give you a particular number. So how many references should I have? I think you should approach this question from how many parts of your essay are there? We know there's an introduction, we know there's a part one, we know there's a part two, we know there's a part three. We know generally how long each of those parts are going to be. Um, around probably 150 words for the introduction, and then what does that leave for the rest of it? About 450 for each of those other sections. So then your question is, well, how many references should you have within a particular paragraph? If you've got part one is 450 words, that's probably two paragraphs. Part two's 450 words, that's probably two paragraphs. Part three is 450 words, that's probably two paragraphs. So what you're looking at here is an essay that's going to be constructed of around five to six paragraphs. So the question is then, how many references do you think it's effective to have in each of those paragraphs? Is it effective to have one reference for each 200 odd word paragraph? Probably not. It probably doesn't quite feature there because that probably shows that you're not doing a lot of reading around. Is it appropriate to have two references, two good quality references that you really explore within a paragraph? That probably gets us a little bit closer. So probably 2 to 3 references per paragraph. It would make sense. So that is going to equal overall probably about 15 references. 15 to 20 references is probably about the amount. But please do not just listen to me saying 15 to 20 references and listen to what I'm saying about how you should use those references within there. Because that's the really key part. Rather than just having references in for the sake of it, it's about using those references to make a really good point. And this is what works. Generally people say, for every 1,000 words you do, you should have about 10 references. So if you're doing a 7,000 word dissertation, you're probably going to have about 70 references. And it does work like this because that's how paragraphs are then broken down. Yeah, that's all good. What counts as an academic reference? Is it okay to use websites? Academic references, ask us if you're not sure, but generally speaking, this is going to be a peer-reviewed journal article. So the things that we recommend in the suggested readings. So anything that has got a reference list is normally a good way of understanding is an academic reference. Things like HBR articles are good for starters, starting to get an understanding about topics, but they're not particularly theoretically heavy. That's why they're the suggested readings before you come to the lecture. So HBR, I would say you can avoid for this particular assignment and instead go to the academic articles that those HBR articles are based on because they exist. And is it okay to use websites? Generally, no. Sometimes it can be, but when you're coming down to academic theory and academic literature, please go back to the originals, please go back to the journals, please go back to the chapters, please go back to the books. Websites in this assignment, I would only really expect to see websites for any organizational examples that you're bringing in rather than anything related to theory or literature. So we want to see it from peer-reviewed journals. Real life organization covered this. Does it count as a reference? No, unless it's an academic article itself. No, it doesn't count as a reference. So the suggestion is to separate out your reference lists between, you've got an academic reference list and an organizational reference list. And then if you need more help with referencing, you can go to the UCL library website and they've got information about the Harvard referencing styles. So that's everything that I want to say. Final point is about drafting. When you're drafting, my suggestion is the first draft that you do, don't just write one draft because it's not going to be the best one. It's going to be your first thought. It's great that it exists, but it's not going to be your best piece. I would say for your first draft, it can tend to write over the word count. I would normally, for an essay, if I was writing a 1,500 word essay, I would probably aim to write about 2,000 words for my first draft because your first draft will be too descriptive in relation to the organization. You're going to put too much information about the organization. So I would suggest your first draft, write it over the word count. In your second draft, what you're going to do is you're going to trim that all back. So you're going to trim back the descriptive parts and really leave in those analytical and parts that really apply to the application. So first draft is just kind of like all of your ideas all in one place. Don't censor yourself too much. Don't try and make it really, really neat and effective. Just try and get your answer down with some sort of narrative and with some kind of answer to it. In the second one, neaten that up by taking out the descriptive work. And in the third draft, that's when you really go through and say, how effectively am I answering the question? So it's almost like first draft is the bit where you're just dumping. Second draft is the bit where you're focusing on the analysis and the application. Third draft is when you're focusing on the presentation and the evaluation and the argumentation. That would be my suggestion for drafting. And as we said before, just overall advice is it's probably better to aim to be slightly more theory heavy than you think it should be when it comes to evaluating the pros and cons of what have happened in the organization. Other than that, listen, wish you very, very good luck. We're really looking forward to reading your assignments. And make sure that you catch up with the other videos that have been posted if you want more advice about theory and literature, about finding literature, and about writing a case study analysis.